Welcome to the 700 Club. Israel is escalating its military operation against Hamas in Gaza City. While it's winning the war on the ground, a new study indicates Israel is losing the global public relations battle.
Meanwhile, Israel's prime minister has put the discussion of annexing some key biblical lands on hold, at least for now. Julie Stahl brings us the story from Jerusalem.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly removed discussions of annexing much of the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria off the agenda today, according to the Jerusalem Post. That move comes after a warning from the United Arab Emirates that annexing the biblical heartland, known as the West Bank, could endanger the Abraham Accords, saying the action would be a red line. The move to annex the area came in response to Western nations' decision to recognize a Palestinian state at the UN this month. Regional and local council heads from Judea and Samaria, along with Finance Minister Smotrich, laid out a plan for sovereignty over more than 80% of Judea and Samaria, leaving a number of Palestinian city-states in the West Bank.
Beyond the historical, biblical, and moral right of the Jewish people to their land, sovereignty has a paramount security role to prevent the establishment of an Arab state in the heart of our homeland.
U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee told CBN News that he and President Trump have not discussed the issue.
Generally, the president's attitude has been not just with Israel, but with countries around the world. You're a sovereign nation. You make your own decisions.
Meanwhile, Houthi rebels continue to launch missiles at Israel, including one with a deadly cluster warhead. They were all intercepted before reaching Israeli territory. In Gaza, Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir says Israel is expanding combat and intensifying its operations against Hamas in order to achieve the objectives of returning the hostages and defeating Hamas. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump warned Hamas on Wednesday to set the hostages free. Tell Hamas to immediately give back all 20 hostages, not 2 or 5 or 7, and things will change rapidly. It will end. In Jerusalem and elsewhere in Israel, protests to free the hostages turned violent. Demonstrators set fire to a car near the prime minister's residence. Netanyahu says the war could end immediately if Hamas agrees to the conditions set by the Security Cabinet, including the release of all 48 hostages, Hamas disarmed, and Israel has security control in the Gaza Strip. But even as Israel makes military progress against Hamas, a new report from Bar-Ilan University shows how Israel is having difficulty in the global narrative about the war, pointing out how false information about stories like a genocide in Gaza is often spread by Hamas and others to make Israel look bad, creating a major public relations problem for the Jewish state. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, I'll make a not-so-bold prediction. Hamas is not going to surrender. They're not going to voluntarily release the hostages. They're not going to lay down their arms, and they're not going to give up control of Gaza. That is just seems to be part of the plan. Their plan has been, let's use this as a PR battle against the very nation, the very existence of Israel. Let's turn our war zone into a crime scene so that international groups will come and they'll measure every single death. They'll look at nutrition for all the residents. And they won't ask the larger question, which is, well, there was poverty, there was malnourishment prior to October 7th. That Hamas is intentionally using its own population in this propaganda war, that they're intentionally putting their headquarters underneath hospitals and mosques and schools, that they intentionally roped in the UN and UNRWA and had key members of their hierarchy embedded within those organizations. They want us never to look at that. What they want to look at is here's someone with a pan in their hands who's asking for food. There's an even larger picture here, and that is the Palestinians have never wanted their own Palestinian state. What they've always wanted is there to be no Israel. That goes back to 1948. That was the reason the Arab nations declared war. There was an opportunity for there to be a Palestinian state. That opportunity was refused. And it's been refused again and again and again. In 1967, Israel offered back all of the land, the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza, all of those territories in return for peace. And the Arabs famously gave the three no's: no recognition, no peace. They're bent on wiping Israel off the map. When we buy into that propaganda war, when we somehow start to think Israel is an apartheid state or a genocidal state or all of those memes that are going all around the world, none of that is true. What is true is Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map. And if they can't do it with conventional weapons, they are absolutely going to use propaganda. In other news, President Trump is facing roadblocks for his plans to use the National Guard to fight crime. John Jessup has that story and more from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. The president wants to use the Guard in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, and New Orleans to help bring down high crime rates. But some of the leaders in those places don't want the help. And as CBN's chief political analyst David Brody reports, there's a debate whether the Constitution allows the president to do it.
On the streets of Chicago, leaders and activists have been clear. They don't want President Trump sending the National Guard in for their high crime rate there. The president doesn't seem to care about that.
Well, we're going in. I didn't say when. We're going in. I'm the president of the United States. If I think our country's in danger, and it is in danger in these cities, I can do it.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker disagrees.
What President Trump is doing is unprecedented and unwarranted. It is illegal. It is unconstitutional. It is un-American.
So far, the courts have agreed. One judge recently ruled it was illegal for President Trump to send the National Guard to help quell immigration protests in California. That judge, along with Governor Pritzker and Democrats, point to the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 that essentially says the federal government can't use the United States military to enforce civilian law. Now, there is an exception, however, and that's where the Insurrection Act of 1807 comes into play. Basically, it says that the president can use the military to enforce civilian law in order to suppress rebellion on domestic violence or to enforce certain laws in certain situations. It's a murky area as to whether the high crime rates actually meet that standard.
I think it is an acute crisis in some of these cities.
Zach Smith is a senior legal fellow with the Heritage Association. He believes the president could legally use the National Guard as long as they were used to protect federal agents sent to those cities to enforce the law.
One of the core clear exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act is that federal troops can protect federal property and federal agents while they are enforcing federal law.
Presidents have federalized the National Guard before. Eisenhower did it in the 50s to enforce desegregation in Arkansas. President Johnson did it with the Detroit riots of '67, and George H.W. Bush did it in '92 after riots hit L.A. There's no precedent for high crime rates, however, which makes it untested constitutional waters for President Trump to jump right into. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
All right, thank you, David. Well, if you spent any amount of time in a doctor's office, you're all too familiar with the routine of having to repeatedly write down your medical history. The Trump administration wants to replace all of that writing with modern technology. CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson explains the reasons for the move and how it raises concerns about privacy.
President Trump, along with HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Oz, Administrator for Medicare and Medicaid, touted the plan to simplify sharing health information with any doctor or pharmacy.
Today, the dream of easily transportable electronic medical records finally becomes a reality.
As part of the Making Health Technology Great Again, they appeared alongside CEOs of top tech firms like Google, Amazon, Apple, and OpenAI.
Instead of filling out the same tedious paperwork at every medical appointment, patients will simply be able to grant their doctors access to their records at the push of a button, just a button, and you're all set, and all the information the doctor needs will be immediately transmitted.
Smartphone apps store your complete health history, which would be instantly shared by scanning a QR code.
And it shows your height, your weight, your blood type, your BMI, your cardiac markers, your diabetes markers, your cholesterol, and any kind of individualized treatments they got.
Those in the medical field agree it's time for an upgrade to America's outdated health information sharing system.
I don't always have information from a recent hospital visit. If a patient goes to the emergency room, they may not be able to get care started as soon because the providers don't know what they're taking if maybe you come in and you're not conscious. So there are things that we would love to fix.
While these apps would involve voluntary participation from both patients and providers, they would not be linked to any government database. In addition to storing our health information, the apps would take it a step further by using AI to interpret the data and offer personalized advice about diet, medications, exercise, and more. Ideally, the apps would lead to improved health, especially for people with diabetes or obesity.
The key is the unlocking of the data, because the more data that AI has, the better it performs.
While this tech sounds good, privacy concerns abound because it's unclear whether security can be guaranteed, something very important when it comes to your personal, sensitive health information.
If this system were to share doctor's notes and you had a certain medication or you had a diagnosis that was more private to you, or you had clinical notes that the doctor had written that would reveal information about your progress, those would be things that most of us wouldn't just be sharing just all over the place.
Worries include insurance companies possibly discovering information and using it to increase your rate or even cancel a policy. So while most Americans would love to ditch the clipboard, privacy concerns could be a deal breaker. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
It's a balance, Gordon, between the streamlining of these written documents and our information and the convenience against those privacy concerns.
It is a balance, and it also is a balance having to do with your care. But don't assume that a doctor treating you has knowledge of your medical history. I had to learn the hard way in hospital visits with my parents that they didn't have that. They weren't familiar with the entire history, and I found myself having to recite it to them again and again because I had the medical power of attorney and had control over those decisions. On one hand, it would certainly be a lot easier, and if you can imagine an emergency room visit where you're not conscious and your medical history could disclose whatever medications you're on. Those are critical in certain instances. If you're on a blood thinner and you have a stroke, there's some very serious complications if you take stroke medications. So it's a balancing, and I think ultimately it should be up to the individual patient what they want to disclose or what they want to keep private. Right now, you don't have that option. Everything seems to be siloed and not communicated, in fact, illegal to communicate. But wouldn't it be wonderful if you could pick and choose, well, I don't want the doctor notes disclosed, or I don't want this particular thing disclosed, but these other things, if it helps my care, why not leave it to the patient to make those decisions? And that way it all becomes a whole lot easier when you're filling out those forms.